Hello everyone, welcome back to Too Sweet MTG and welcome to another Cube Tuesdays. In today's episode, we're going to be doing a deep dive into mono green. Today's episode is taken from our podcast Powerful Nothing, so if you enjoy it, do check it out. It's available on all podcasting platforms everywhere now. I co-host the podcast with James, who you'll know from the CubeSet reviews that we do on the channel. But anyway, let's jump in. Time for me to hand it over to me. We are going to be talking about mono green in Cube. We're going to be giving you an overview of the archetype. We're going to be telling you the cards to include in your cube if it's something you want to play with yourself, how it plays and how to draft it, and also, importantly, where it is positioned in 2023, because this is one of the oldest archetypes in Cube. Like as far as I'm aware, this has been around since the early days of the vintage Cube. There's always been something big, something dumb, and something mono-green about it. James, do you want to tell us what is mono green and what is it trying to do?
Yeah, for sure. So mono green obviously is in and of itself just a deck that only features green cards. But when we talk about mono green and Cube, we're really talking about a pretty linear ramp strategy in general. So this is something that's going to really prioritize starting off with cheap elves, so cheap creatures that tap for mana. Ideally, you want to play one on turn one. There are some phenomenal ones that cost 2 mana as well. For example, the Fellows, which is green for 2/1, taps for a green for each forest you control. So you play it on turn 2, and then on turn 3, if you played another forest, you can tap for 3 green mana. And what mono green is trying to do is generally looking to get up to the 7 or 8 mana mark. It's not, in its traditional form of mono green, it's generally not that interested in like 4 and 5 drops trying to win the game with them. It's really trying to get up to, for example, Avenger of Zendikar, or the real closer that mono green decks always want is Craterhoof Behemoth, which is 8 mana. I think it's 5 green for a 5/5. When it enters the battlefield, creatures you control get +X and gain trample until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. So you play that with more than sort of 3 or more creatures in play, and the game almost always ends immediately. You just turn your creatures sideways, and they're not going to have enough points of toughness to block with. And that can definitely be really powerful. Say the accelerants are really, really powerful in these in the higher powered cubes, and even going down the power level slightly, just ramping out with elves can be very good. But if we're looking at the vintage cubes and even the sort of the legacy cube, things like the Fellows that I mentioned before, Jiraga Tree Speaker, which is a 1 mana 1/2. If you pay 2 mana to level it up, it gains the ability to tap for 2 green mana. Things like
that is fine.
It is for green solving. The dream curve, I guess, of mono green is something like Jiraga Tree Speaker, level it up on turn 2, play over Fellows on turn 2. On turn 3, you have 8 mana. This is not bad. This ends games. That is still a good strat, and it can certainly still win games. Gaia's Cradle is another land that really, really turbocharges your mana generation. And then you do have good 5s that you can play. Things like Plow Under, which is a 5 mana sorcery that puts 2 lands on top of your opponent's deck, is a real good way to bury them after you've got off to a quick start. Things like Nissa, doubling all your forest's mana and making 3/3s is very strong. But yeah, really at some point you're looking to get up to those real expensive cards. Craterhoof to just kill them. Terastodon, which can blow up non-creature permanents. It basically Beast Within's 3 things. It kills 3 things, and whoever controlled it gets a 3/3 for each thing. So sometimes you kill your own lands to send them to 3/3s. Sometimes you kill your opponent's lands so they don't have any mana.
Specifically, you never give them 3 beasts that can block your 9/9. That is the key part with that.
That is often a mistake I've seen people make.
I have made that one, don't worry.
Yeah. And then another card which really maximizes, and it can be a real big power level spike for this deck, is Natural Order. That's the 2 green sorcery. There's an additional cost. You sack a creature, and you can search your library for any green creature card and put it into play. So you can just get this out very reliably by turn 3 in a mono green deck, because you're basically always going to play an elf in the first 2 turns of the game, and then on turn 3 you can go and get your terrasses on the game end. And that will win a lot of games. However, it does tend to be a pretty vulnerable game plan. When all your mana dorks die, you're looking at your 8 drops in your hand, and you can get real sad about them real quick. Yeah, and then one of the other key cards, or can be one of the other key cards, but put some different deck building pressures on you, can be Channel. This is obviously a really, really busted card. This is a green. Until the end of your turn, you can pay a life to make a colorless mana. Obviously, this isn't good at casting Crater of Behemoth, because it's green to cast it. And then Crater of Behemoth costs triple green, so you need 5 green mana total. It's kind of tough. But if you can get some of your top end to be either completely colorless is ideal, obviously, but even some of the slightly less pip intensive stuff, Old One Eye or something, Channel can lead to having a really busted start. And obviously you just give yourself outs of some ridiculous turn 2 Ulamog without any, even if they kill your elf, which is a pretty unique angle for mono green deck to play. So it's definitely worth keeping an eye out for, but just want to be aware that it doesn't go in every deck.
Yeah, Channel's a super busted card. I've been tempted to add it to mine, but is that too good for an unpowered cube? It's on the line, I think. It
is on the line. I suppose you could put it in for a cube or 2 and see how it plays, but
we won't tell anyone.
Certainly, Channel Emrakul has Fast Oracle to Mono Consultation vibes to it.
No, 100%. One of the things that we'll kind of get onto as we talk about mono green in a bit more detail is a lot of the cards that you mentioned there are a bit old. And I think maybe some of them are starting to show their age a little bit. Like I think the most recent card you mentioned there was probably Nissa, which that's got to be a little bit old. Like I love Plow Under, but Plow Under is a little bit of an old card, and maybe these are starting to see their age. Before we go into kind of that, I think so generally speaking, this type of big mono green you are seeing in things like the Vintage Cube, and generally unrestricted cubes that can run rares, that can run mythics, that kind of thing. You do see this a lot in Legacy Cube. There it is definitely more Planeswalker based. I think that's where kind of you see the Nisses and the Garrux, there's some that kind of untap lands and that kind of stuff. So you can kind of make a bunch more mana with your Cradle by twiddling it, or Nykthos Shrine to Nyx. That's another one I think you see in more kind of Legacy cubes. And this will also 100% be the Nykthos strategy is something you'll see more on the Arena Cube as well. Mono green is generally everywhere. It's one of the staple archetypes, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to talk about it. Even when you go down to Peasant, people still love ramping out to Palaka Worm. So we've gone over some key cards. We're not going to list off all the mana dorks. There is about 4 or 5 Llanowar Elves. You want all of those in your deck. In terms of drafting this, if you were in a draft and you were thinking mono green is either open or is something you wanted to force, what are the cards you would want to see in your packs to let you know that you are good and safe to go into it?
So I think in terms of your priorities, with a few exceptions, don't need to prioritize the expensive cards that much. You can get them, and hopefully, if you're drafting mono green, you're the only person drafting mono green, and no one else is taking them from you. So I think in general, you really want to prioritize those 1 mana elves, because your draws that don't start with a 1-mana elf are often just going to be that extra turn slower, and then gives your opponent about one more turn they need to either take you off a lot of mana or do something really powerful and proactive of their own. And that is, I think, often more how you lose the game than you had a slightly suboptimal 7-drop. I will say I think the exception to that is Kratos Behemoth exactly. Because all the other mono green top end stuff is I put loads and loads of stuff into play and I'm going to kill you with it next turn. Whereas Kratos Behemoth just kills you with the mana dorks the turn you cast it. And that's a really big deal. It means they can't just untap and wrap you. So I'd say, yeah, your most important cards I'd put as like Kratos, Natural Order, and then the really busted mana dorks. So primarily Raphellos, but also Jiraga Tree Speaker being really high on that list. And those are, in terms of very early in the draft, not knowing what else I need for my mono green deck, if I knew I was mono green, those potential and Gaia's Cradle, and those are basically the only cards I'm taking over Llanowar Elves. Because you just need that real high density of 1-mana elves. You can't, if you need to, you can put like Sylvan Caryatid and Wall of Roots and things like that in your deck, but you're pretty unhappy about it. Actually, you want to be starting that Vamp train going on turn 1 in as many games as possible. You need that redundancy. You're hoping to have like 5 1-mana elves.
Exactly, yeah, because as you said, we're not going like we're not trying to play a 3-drop on turn 2. We're trying to play an 8-drop on turn like 3 or 4. So you really need to get them down as early as possible, basically.
Yeah, 100%. And like your great draws of ones that start off like 1-mana elf into a bunch more ramp on turn 2, like
into 2 more elves on turn 2. Yeah,
2 more elves, or like you can play one of them, but sort of slightly more expensive ramp spells that gets you 2 mana, or just obviously Raphellos, which is like 2 mana but taps for 3 the next turn because that card's unbelievably broken in the right deck. So you need to prioritize that bottom of your curve. You need to prioritize your Kratos and your Natural Order because those lead to you doing really, really broken stuff. And then you kind of fill out your deck with some Planeswalkers, like 5-mana Nissa is one of the better ones here, but you can play like any of the Garruks, they're kind of all fine. The 4-mana one that makes beasts and untaps lands is quite nice because it kind of does both parts of what you want. Like if you have that out very early, then it can ramp you to that 8 mana. Untapping Gaia's Cradle is particularly nice, but it can also just pump out some 3/3s and help you stabilize the board, offset some beatdown threat on its own. And then the last thing is if you have Kratos, then more ways to find Kratos are really nice. Obviously, Natural Order is one that's just broken, but also things like Finale of Devastation can be quite good here. You just cut one of your other expensive cards you'd play for Finale of Devastation, and that plays like very close to a second Kratos.
No, exactly. And yeah, I think just to add on, if you have the Cradle, then obviously things like Expedition Map and Crop Rotation, so you can go find the Cradle, can really lead to some explosive turns. Like those are some of the few cards that don't generate you mana themselves, but go and find your ways of generating a ton of mana. I find those to be quite strong. From all the cards we've mentioned, it doesn't sound like there's much like interaction. Like you're not like there's no like Beast Within or anything like that. Like it is kind of a very A plus B equals kill. You're interacting with your opponent's life total by hitting them with something big. Is that kind of fair to say, James?
Yeah, pretty much. And there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, what's the good interaction you have in mono green? It's pretty limited. But even if you get something like a Dismember, honestly, it's kind of a tough sell in mono green. And the reason is that because most of your cards basically don't do anything on their own. you need to draw the ramp and the payoffs every draw, because you're not realistically getting to your Avenger of Zendikar, your Crater Huff by just playing lands. So you need to have that redundancy of ramp, and most of your other spells are just mana, One for wanting with your opponent is actually really quite bad in mono green. You need a lot of resources to do your thing. Basically any card where you're exchanging one of your cards for one of their cards, taking resources out of the game, you'd call it it's very much, I'd say, to use sort of limited terminology, it's a big game deck. You want more resource in the game, not fewer. So you don't want to be trading resources with your opponent most of the time. You want to be building up your resources to do your overwhelmingly powerful thing that's going to win you the game. Obviously, I'm not saying you can't board in a Dismember if you think you really need it, but in general, it's not a card you're looking for. And that goes for similar cards.
What's the big persist creature? Like, if you can ramp something like that out.
Woodfall Primus.
Yeah, that's it. That's a bit of removal. You're fine running because it removes and it answers something while also being a massive beater that you can win the game with. It's something like if there are answers in this deck, it's normally on the big top end. Like I know some of them were running like Dragon Lord Ataka, which when it comes into play deals 5 damage divided around things, basically. Like if you're going to be answering something, it's with your big game-winning threats, basically.
Yeah, 100%. You can also run land destruction in this deck, just because...
that's quite nice, yeah.
Because you're getting it out very early, and things like Plow Under's the best one, but also like Acidic Slime can be acceptable. Because land destruction... Like, a lot of decks don't want those cards because, like, land destruction has a very small window of opportunity to be good. Because once your opponent's got their big threats down, then blowing up their lands kind of does next to nothing. But Plow Under, if you're reliably casting it on turn 3, can be very good. It just buries your opponent.
I think, Plow Under is actually one of the... It's a card that specifically only mono green wants. So I'll just read Plow Under now. So it's 3 green for a sorcery. Put 2 target lands on top of their opponent's library. So what you said, James, about playing it on turn 3. What you're realistically doing with this is like it's semi-land destruction. For me, it's more of just like a massive tempo play. Like, you're doing this on turn 3, and you're like, basically your opponent is only drawing lands for the next 2 turns. They're back on resources. So in theory, you can then, like, if you played this 5-drop on turn 3. On the next turn, on your turn 4, they're going to have 2 lands in play at best, like 2-3 lands in play. You can then ramp out your big things while your opponent's like just been tempoed out of the game.
Yeah, 100%. But I mean, it sounds like hyperbole, but there are a lot of games where it feels like you time walked twice with Plow Under. If you're on the play, you Plow Under on turn 3, you put their only 2 lands back on top of their library. They're going to spend the next 2 turns just replaying those lands, and it's very hard for them to come back from that.
So we've drafted our deck. We have our mana dorks. We have hopefully either like a Gaia's Cradle or a Natural Order to let us do something a bit broken. And we have some big dumb things to kind of ramp into or cheat into play. And how do you view the makeup, James? So let's start, I think, with the lands, because I personally love running 16 and less lands in Cube. I'm assuming this is a deck with all the mana dorks that lets you run like where are we going? Are we going 15? Are we going 14 in like a mono green deck? Or are we being sensible and sticking around the 16, 17 mark?
I don't like to go below 15. I definitely see a lot of people doing it. And I understand why, because you look at your cards and you're like, oh, all these cards make mana. I don't need any mana dorks. But the thing is, if you're playing an elf but then missing your land drop, you're not actually ramping. That's just equivalent to like you played your land, but it can die to a shock. You need to be ramping and hitting your lands, and you're just gonna try to play your massive thing really quickly and hope it's good enough. Honestly, because if you get too aggro with cutting lands, then firstly, you're not ramping as quickly because if you're missing land drops and paying your dogs, you're not really achieving that much. But also, if someone kills your mana dork and you're not drawing into those land drops, you just have no way to get back into the game. I'm not saying play 17 if you have like 5 1-drop dorks and a bunch of 2s, because obviously you will flood. But I don't like going down to the like 14s and 13s, which I definitely see people doing. Also worth noting, in some ways, Gaia's Cradle doesn't count because it doesn't tap your elf on turn 1. It also doesn't help you, like if they wrath you, doesn't help you build back. You kind of maybe want to count Gaia's Cradle as half a land, and see the other half of it as like a really good ramp thing, because it's because you can't keep your like 1 land hand if it's a Cradle, right? And you can't keep your like Forest Cradle the Fellows hand because it just doesn't tap for mana if there's no creature.
No, that makes sense. And then in terms of like we've already mentioned, kind of like you don't, apart from Kratos, you don't necessarily need to like aggressively draft the big things because there's plenty of big things. Like you can take the big green creatures and also the big artifact creatures. But kind of like, how many do you think you need as a top?
So a lot of it depends on how many ways do I have to find them. I kind of view like, so for example, Finale, I kind of just count as a big thing.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. It's something you're dumping all your mana into, and it will do the job basically. Because Finale goes and finds you the big creature. Yeah,
exactly. And the same with Green Sun Zenith, and that's why probably a card that Paul mentioning earlier. Actually, why Zenith is very powerful. This is the green and an X sorcery. Search for a green creature card with CMC X or less. Put it into play. Very powerful because it's a 2-mana accelerant, right? On turn 2, you can go and get your 1-drop elf with it. Obviously, it's a bit less efficient when you're playing the elf, but it's important as an option. But it's also like you can spend 9 mana and put Kratos Behemoth into play, or 8 mana and put Avenger of Zendikar into play, and that's very important. And that is one of the few tools you have to reduce variance. So yeah. Basically, it depends how many ways I have to find them. I would be aiming for about 5 big things or ways to find big things. And obviously, and you probably don't want to be all in as 1 Kratos Behemoth and 4 ways to find it, because if they exile it or something, somehow you're in a lot of trouble. And yeah, you don't want too many because you don't want to draw a bunch of them, but you also you don't want to just have one get fort seized and then be doing nothing for the rest of the game. So it is kind of a fine balancing act. I tend to kind of err on the side of I want like 5 so that I reliably see 2.
That does make a lot of sense.
Because I don't want to be dead because my opponent dealt with one. And then in terms of the rest of the makeup, the lands basically as many 1-mana dorks as I can get. I don't think I would ever, even the not great ones, I very rarely cut. Then you kind of fill it out with what's in between. These are the planeswalkers and the.
How do you feel on like utility creatures, like things like a Scavenging Ooze, something like that?
Scavenging Ooze is like playable for sure. I feel like the really good mono green decks, you leave it in the sideboard, honestly.
No, it makes sense.
You board it in when it's good, but it's it's not enough on its own, right? And it doesn't really progress you towards your core game, towards your game plan.
No, exactly. I think it's kind of this is leading us on to nicely kind of like what is mono green's good and bad matchups. So you've drafted mono green, you've kind of taken the key guys that we're after. You have a good, healthy breakdown of mana dorks. You have hopefully a natural order or a cradle to allow you to do something big and dumb and get out your big thing. So you're sitting down and playing against your opponents. Kind of, what are you hoping to play against, James? If you're mono green, like let's start with the plus. Like what are you hoping to play against?
So I think probably the deck you're most happy to play against, and is one of the best decks in lots and lots of cubes, which is very nice for you, is White Weenie. Because you just go so much bigger than them so quickly, and they're not meaningfully interacting with your stuff. they might have 1 to 2 removal spells that are cheap enough to like answer your mana dorks. Because a lot of your threats do a lot of ETB stuff. You don't care that much if they swords it. But you care if they swords your land elves or your fellows for sure, but they only have so many. It's not like a red deck where they can have a whole bunch of burn spells for them. And then their payoffs, they're going to play an Adeline or something, and you're going to laugh at it and play your 6-drop. It really just doesn't matter. It's exactly the sort of magic Mono Green wants to play. They're going to play a 2-drop into a 3-drop into a 4-drop that can all attack pretty well in most matchups, but you're just going to play a 7-drop that invalidates all of them on its own. And they don't really have great ways to answer that. And a lot of their ways they slow down other decks are mana denial, stuff like Thalia and Drainwing Mare, this sort of stuff. And you really don't care about any of them. Partly because a lot of it attacks as non-creatures and you're playing a lot of big creatures, but also just even if you're talking about something like an Ugin, say, or Karn, the 7-drop Karn, making your 7-drop cost 8 mana is actually doesn't matter that much because your deck's very capable of getting to 10. It's not nearly as big of a deal as making the blue player's Ponder cost 2 mana. So I think that I would say is probably your best matchup, and that's really good for mono green because mono white is also an incredibly popular deck in lots and lots of cubes, and tends to be one of the better decks. The matchups that can go either way. It's the sort of mid-rangey decks are.
I could see that because you're still going bigger than them, basically.
You're still going a lot bigger than them, but they have interaction. And it really depends a lot what sort of interaction they have. And just if they're able to line it up well in the game. But if they know if your opponent has lots and lots of ways to kill your mana dorks, that can be a really big problem for you. But if they're just trying to value you out for 3 to 5 mana threats, you're very much okay with that. You're gonna go really big and laugh at their planeswalker because it just doesn't matter. But if they're the sort of mid-range deck which has a whole bunch of cheap burn for your 1 and 2 drops and maybe some hand disruption, maybe some counter spells, then you can get in trouble because your draws are not going to be that redundant. If they deal with your first 2 threats, often just going to fall over and die, and if they kill all your dogs, you're also going to fall over and die. And then they're random, I don't know, Fable of Moonbreaker, whatever they happen to have, will just do enough to win them the game.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And then in terms of bad matchups, I'm assuming it's burn or like a deck running a lot of burn, like a Red X deck that can answer all your little dorks. And I'm kind of assuming mono green doesn't do well against control.
Yeah, so control specifically, if it has the sort of unconditional counter spells, is very, very tough. It's just going to be hard for you to line up your threats, and they're generally going to be able to counter a couple of them. Maybe they raff your board away. Very hard to come back from that. And very quick combo, also very tough for you. Anyone who's going quicker than you just have no tools. Things like Reanimator, very, very tricky. A good Storm deck that is reliably that turn quicker than you, very tough. You have some tools against them. You have things like Endurance is not a card you want to main deck, but should be taken really pretty highly for that Reanimator matchup. But the problem with mono green, a lot of the problem you run into is because you don't have any form of card selection, you really just play the cards you draw. even if you have that one endurance somewhere in your 40, it's not like you can dig for it really in any meaningful way.
And you're not really going to want a natural order for it, are you?
Exactly. Yeah. That's a tough way to do it. And then, hand disruption again can be very strong because mono green is just that sort of deck where you live or die by the top of your library. It's an inherently high variance strategy. You have very limited ways to overcome that. And that means if you get a hand that has like dorks and some payoff, like, you just have to keep it. You can't be like, oh, I need to find my endurance. Like, that's just not option. And then you just kind of live or die by what comes off the top of your deck. You keep your 2-lander with a dork, they kill the dork. Sometimes you just like sit there drawing 5 to 8 mana cards, and there's not that much you can do about that. You really don't have that much agency sometimes. Those quick combo decks can be very tough if they like. There's also, if you think about like a reanimator deck, right? They're doing their fast combo thing, but will also be able to interact. Your reanimator deck will play some removal spells. They'll play some way to kill your dogs. They'll play some sports users. They might be blue for some counter spells. They have all of their cards that aren't combo cards are interacting with you. Whereas you are just doing your thing and hoping it is good enough. You have very limited meaningful ways to interact back.
Cool. So that's an overview of mono green, kind of what it is, what it does, what its matchups are. One of the reasons I think wanted to talk about this today is because this is such a popular archetype that is definitely not as strong as it used to be. So we've kind of, I guess, built it up a little bit. Now we're going to kind of tear it down and see what we're left with, because mono green definitely has some issues. I think kind of the most broken thing mono green can do is kind of like dork, cradle, dork, natural order on turn 3 or 4 into a crater hoof and then swing through and win. But the issue with that play pattern, and with a lot of the play pattern in general, is that you need to hit a certain sequence of your cards in order to like kind of really optimize the deck. Like you really need to go dork, big thing. Like if you draw those cards out of sequence, or if you have to mulligan, that kind of thing, it can really set you back. Like, and there's other ways where things can go wrong. Like you can have your hoof stuck in your hand, so you can't natural order for it. Like the other issue with natural ordering is that you have to sack a creature, so you're down a creature. If you're going to get hoof to swing through and win, you have to have enough creatures untapped to do it, which means you technically need more mana than the 4 that you're generating from natural order to go get it and put it into play. Another thing, James, if you want to take this, like it's very interactable. Basically, there's a lot of ways of stopping mono green.
Yeah, for sure. It's so obviously it's one of those decks where whatever interaction your opponent has put in their deck, it will be good against you.
That's not a good feeling. Everything, every bit of interaction. Yeah.
Removal, great, kills the dorks, kills some of the big stuff. Counter spells, phenomenal. Counter your 1 payoff. Hand disruption, if I have it on turn 1, can be really backbreaking. Like they take your cheap dog, but you're in a lot of trouble. And if your hand lines up differently, you can take the payoff. It's kind of like, whatever they draw, it's probably going to work out and be pretty effective. Having said that, it's dealing with the big things is like you often only need one of them, so it often feels like you have outs at least. Your draw steps are very live, but also, you're often hoping for like 2 or 3 cards off the top of your deck, and you just keep drawing the Llanowar Elves and the lands, and they don't do anything.
I've been there, yes.
Ultimately, that's a lot of what is left in your deck at that point. And that would be fine. A lot of the other proactive decks, like all this removals, all this stuff's good against them as well, right? You play your, your like artifact combo deck, whatever. Yeah, sure, like the removal's good. You kill the welder. Your hand disruption's great. You're a combo deck. So it's cancel. The difference is those decks get to interact back. They're not all just they're not all just ramp and payoff and nothing else. And some of their cards you can just cast them on their own and they're fine. Whereas mono green really doesn't get to. You have upsides from this. You're quicker than those decks. You're often doing something more powerful, but you're very one-dimensional, and you don't really get to govern your draws. So you kind of just keep your opening hand. You're like, well, there's loads of things this hand can't beat, but yep, keep. Here's my elf. Let's see what happens. Let's hope it's good enough. You're not really going back and forth. There are sort of ways you can bail out of this a little bit, where you try and get more of the really pushed sort of 4 and 5 mana cards in your deck, which you can actually just cast and do stuff. So, for example, you can try and splash something like Minsk and Boo as phenomenally powerful. And, they kill your first 2 dorks, you can just cast Minsk and do it on turn 4, and they'll die a lot of the time. Same to a lesser extent with certain things like Questing Beast, Nissa Who Shakes the World can do a little bit of this stuff. But it is a bit like, at this point, should we just be leaning into that more and not be playing all these 8-drops, because splashing is really painful. Your cards are very, very pip intensive. If you're mono green and you pick up something like a Minsk and Boo or an Oko or something where you're like, I really, really want to splash this, you need to take fixing very, very highly. The best form of that is often like Birds of Paradise type stuff, the dorks for tap for any color, but also obviously the dual lands. You often care about forest type, so you want to be a little bit cautious of the untapped duals, and you really don't want to put tap lands in your green ramp decks.
No, that's dreadful.
Yeah, exactly. So you do need to be like, okay, got a Minsk and Boo taking Tiger over the world a little bit.
No, exactly. And that's kind of, at that point you are kind of almost changing into a different deck, because one of the strengths with mono white, mono red, and mono green, like any monocolor strategy, is that you don't have to use your picks on fixing. You can just take the best card for your deck, and then as soon as you start splashing, you have to then reliably able to cast it. So it means it's going to affect. You're not like, maybe if you take a Minsk and Boo early, are you going to take the 3rd copy of Llanowar Elves, which you probably need for your deck, or are you going to take the fetch land to go and get the land to help you splash it? Like at what point do you move into a different deck entirely, and you're not really the big ramp value deck? When are you just playing good stuff? And that kind of that kind of does lead like onto a little point of kind of like, just in general, like when we're talking about a lot of the cards that we were going over, like a lot of them are a lot of these kind of big 7-8 mana spells are quite old, and they're really starting to show their age. Like apart from like Atraxa, which is a very good natural order target, Wifey smushed me with that. Most of the cards that we've seen printed that are kind of, they're just being run in green decks in general, like not just Cube, but kind of in green decks in general. Like they are like, it is like Minsk and Boo or Oko, as we kind of mentioned, or like Uro, or just like they are other colors, but also they're like 3 or 4 mana. Like even if you just go to like mono green cards, like Questing Beast or like Under Mountain Adventure, these are just good 4-drops. Like as we mentioned, kind of like playing these on like turn 3, it's definitely more consistent than lining up your sequence of mana dorks and hoping to rip the big thing.
Yeah, 100% agree. And it's at that point it does become of a thing. Well, okay, do we need to be mono green anymore? Like, can we then start looking at blue green? Can we then start looking at even like rule? You get some interaction, you get some more threats, you start getting things that shore up the weaknesses of those green cards. And that is the tension with these, what I'd call sort of the core cards of mono green strategy, the Felosas, the Jiraga Tree Speakers, this stuff. Is
yeah, it's the 2-mana, so the 2-mana big dorks, like not so much the Llanowar elves or the Birds of Paradises, because those kind of go in like any green X deck, as you're mentioning, it is the Raphelos, the Jiraga Tree Speakers, like the Plow Unders. Like, does any other deck apart from mono green want a Plow Under?
Yeah. No, 100%. And I think that touched on another, I think, very important point of what to be thinking about when you're drafting this deck. If you're in this deck and you're like, yes, I'm traditional mono green, I'm trying to cast 8 drops. Firstly, you better have a good reason to think no one else is doing this, because you should not be fighting for this. But once you're in like pack 2 and you're like, okay, I think I'm like the only heavy base green drafter, that lets you draft very differently, because now you know there are a bunch of cards which you just know are going to wheel. It's, you can even do things like you open Raphelos in pack 3, and Raphelos is maybe the best card that you could possibly open in the whole cube. And you will, instead of taking that, you will take a Tiger to splash one into, or you might take a Birds of Paradise, because someone else might be able to use Birds of Paradise and they might take it off you. Whereas if you're that confident you're the only base green drafter, no one else is taking Raphelos from you. So these are the sorts of things you need to be thinking about, but you also need to be thinking, when you're taking these green cards early, okay, if it's not there, how do I pivot off of it? And that's where you can get into those like green multicolor decks, which lean into other colors for more interaction, more good threats, and aren't so much looking to play 8 mana cards.
I think, touching on the draft then, one thing that has definitely been more of a thing in just cube construction in general. So this kind of dates back to like the first Dominaria set in 2018. That was kind of like the one that where Richard Garfield came back and kind of like, no, this is what we're doing, and kind of every set has followed it since then, where basically you have a lot of signpost uncommons in the draft set, like in like standard legal sets, which kind of guide drafters to what they're doing. That's become the norm in draft sets, and is definitely something that's kind of become more of a norm in like cube construction. It's definitely something that when I was building my cube, when I started, I was like, okay, what do all of my guilds do? Monocolored decks fit into that archetype slightly. It's harder to fit them in, basically, because like mono red and mono white, they're aggressive, they're easy to support. They can be aggressive in monocolor combinations or in multiple colors, or in like 2 color combinations. That will still work as a functional deck. With green, it has generally become one of the better support colors for other decks, because we talked about broken cards like Oko and Uro and Minsc and Boo, and like those are green X cards. You're having like, with these other powerful cards that are incentivizing you to play other colors. Like in mono green's heyday, it was definitely a thing of there would be one green player at the table who was getting hooked up with all the cards, and then you had the other decks around that. Correct me if I'm wrong, James, but kind of like in the vintage cube, it's very rare that you have multiple green drafters. Or back in the day when mono green was more powerful, it was rarer that you had multiple green drafters.
Yeah, often when green was just about look at my Kratos behemoth, it tended to be like one person would end up in mono green, or 2 people would end up with really bad mono green decks. Whereas now you often see like 2 to 4 people, say, in green decks, but green X, like 2 to 4 color green decks.
I would say in the cubes that we do with my cube, where we get kind of 8 people drafting, I would say probably like 2/3 to half of the table is in green in some way. Basically, green has been a fantastic support color for a lot of different decks. Like, it's not just mono green anymore. Like, yeah, you can have like persist combos in like Abzandi colors. You can have like a lands deck in like Temur. You can have like 4 or 5 color decks, like things that people trying to play like Omnath or like Golos. They're a 5 color deck, but they're going to be primarily based in green. And it just means that more players are taking the cards from you. So, like, yes, you might be able to get the Cradle, the Natural Order, and the Hoof, but you don't have the other 75% of your deck as available to you as you would have previously.
Yeah, 100%. There's it's just the total bracket of powerful green stuff. The stuff that supports mono green has basically not been added to in like I don't know, like meaningfully, it feels like in the last 10 years. Like, sure, like Nissa Who Shakes the World's a good card, but it's not like they've not been printing more of the Fellows and Geometry Speakers and Kratos Behemoths, right?
No, exactly. I think we were a bit excited about Nissa Ascended Animist. That's the 3 green for Phyrexian mana, like one with completed. So you can either play it as a 5 mana, 3 loyalty planeswalker that upticks and makes you a beast, or a 7 mana, 7 loyalty planeswalker. So kind of I think we were excited with that at the time because I was like, ooh, this is actually a new card for mono green because it's one that you can play earlier when you need to stabilize, or you can play later when you want to win the game. It kind of has that modality. But apart from that, I genuinely can't think of a card they printed that is specifically for mono green in a long time. And I think it's also showing in things like constructed as well. So kind of like a lot of cube archetypes will come from constructed formats, kind of like a lot of like ideas come from what people are brewing. Like you might see something like something might appear in like Legacy or Vintage or Modern or Pioneer, and kind of like you then want to reflect that in your cube. Kind of like there hasn't been many mono green decks in like a wide variety of formats recently. At least ones that translate into cube well. Like yes, Elves has always been a thing in Legacy, but that deck is quite hard to translate into cube. Effectively, you're just rebuilding mono green as we've had it before, but with more Elves. There's going to be like we did see the mono green in quotation marks make a splash in Pioneer. Could that? Is there anything there, James? Like, is there any? Like, is there anything Cube can learn from something like Pioneer, like the Nykthos style strategies and going multiple colors?
So, I mean, the multiple color thing in that deck was really based off Oath of Nissa, and you don't get to put 4 copies of Oath of Nissa in your green deck, but in Cube. But I mean, we can certainly learn the lesson that hey, this Nykthos card is really busted.
Yeah,
but Nykthos does need like pretty meaningful support. Like, there's a reason you're playing like 4 Old Growth Troll and 4 Cavalier Forms in that deck.
Right. Yes,
and
you are pip dense to make that work.
Yes, exactly. And I think Old Growth Troll is a powerful card. There's nothing wrong with it. You certainly could put it in a cube, and I'm sure some people would put it in their mono green decks. But it's not a card that actually leans into this. Inherently leans into getting to loads of mana, because it only does that when you have the Nykthos, and that's kind of off the one of the fundamental. That's the fundamental difference, right, between constructed and cube, is that in constructed you can build your deck in a way where you assume you always have access to particular cards, and it's very hard to do that in cube unless you're playing like a whole bunch of tutors. So I think to say, oh, I'm going to be a Nykthos deck, you'd need to be like a bunch of crop rotations and expedition maps and whatnot. And at that point, you should
be doing other things with it. Yeah,
exactly. And I think in a lot of ways, and obviously very, very different cards, but I think in a lot of ways, Nykthos is like a worse way to do the Gaia's Cradle thing, right?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. It is less. It requires more hoops to make it good, basically.
Yeah. Like if you're going off elves, like Gaia's Cradle is better than a forest when you have 2 elves in play. Nykthos would be better than a forest when you had 4. No, when you had 5.
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah. No, that's a point. Yeah. No, that's fair. I think just some other things to kind of touch on is like, so when we last did a review of the Migo Vintage Cube, they had tried to make some adjustments to mono green to kind of give it a little like. They still obviously wanted it to be a thing because obviously it's nostalgic. It's what people think about, or it's one of the archetypes people think about when they think about the Vintage Cube is mono green. The way they changed it seemed to be they just added a bunch more tutors. give you that density of things to ramp into? Like, you played a bunch of the vintage cube, James. Like, did you see that make much of a difference? Did mono green pick up at all?
I didn't think so. I thought, if anything, it was a little bit worse. I think the thing is, so obviously, you don't get to say, oh, look, here's a demonic tutor for mono green. That card doesn't exist. So it's stuff like Worldly Tutor, where you're down a card or expensive stuff, and it's the thing is, it's never ever a good deal to use that stuff just to go and get your elf, right? So the only thing you're using it for is to go and get your expensive card. And like at that point, is it better to put Worldly Tutor in your deck? Sorry, for Worldly Tutor is green for an instant, put a creature on top from your library on top of your deck. Is it better to put Worldly Tutor in your deck, or is it better to just put another big creature in your deck where you don't have to go down a card to draw it? Because, if you're in that spot where like they've dealt with your threat, but you still have loads of mana and you're just looking for a threat off the top, you'd much rather draw a creature that you can just cast than a Worldly Tutor that's going to get your creature to cast next turn, because they also get to do stuff in the intervening turn. I was not impressed by mono green last cube season. I think it's in a tough spot in that cube, particularly at the moment.
No, definitely, yeah. I think it's something that it's not just we're thinking about. I think a lot of people are thinking about how they can look at like how they can fix mono green to see if there's any ways to kind of like make it what it was. Just off the top of your head, like, are there any? What do you think mono green actually needs for it to be viable again, or for it to kind of bring it back to like a consistent, like a decent power level where it can compete with 2023 cards and 2020 cards? Like, do we need like a second copy of like Natural Order? Do you need another, like, I'm about to list off a load of cards that they're probably not going to do versions of, but like, is it like another Raphelos? Is it another Gaia's Cradle? Is it another Natural Order? Like something like that. Like, is it density, or is it something different?
So I think the thing that got mono green become a lot worse, right, is just the cards, the other cards in the cubes, right? It's the cards around it. And I think I think just the pace of cube has fundamentally changed a lot, and you're no longer the quickest thing. And then the fact that you're inherently high variance and you can't interact then starts really biting, right? So, and it's kind of hard to like speed it up much with cards they're realistically going to print, They're not going to print like, I don't know, a Mox that only works for green creatures or something. This is
exactly.
This is not a reasonable card from Twitter Cube. So I think it probably ends up having to be like green as a color getting more tools to like meaningfully interact with people, or to kind of mitigate some of the variance of the mono green deck. Like kind of like a better version of like an Oath of Nissa sort of thing. I think like Abundant Harvest is actually kind of nice.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So maybe like the give us an actual green ponder then. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. But honestly, even then, like I'm kind of struggling because it's like.
But then like other deck, like the 3-4 color deck is just going to run that. They're going to run that as well.
Yeah.
Like it's this weird niche of kind of like you need a card that specifically cares about green things.
Yeah.
For it to be in a mono green deck, it's specific. Like for it to specifically be a mono green card that exists in like the average cube that is doing the guild things, but also supporting mono green. Yeah, a card for a card to be printed that cares about it, it needs to only be wanted specifically by the mono green player, not by the other players splashing green, and be good enough. And that is a very thin, like Modern Horizons exists. They could print something like there could be a Time Lord that cares about forests or something like that, But like it's not impossible, but it is unlikely.
Yeah, so I think because the reason mono green used to be really good, right, was that the things you could do on turn 4 were fundamentally just way more powerful than things other people were doing on turn. And now other people are playing, like Fable of Mirror into Palace Jailer, and they have like Fury and Solitude and all these really effective, very cheap ways to interact. It's a lot harder to do that now.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of the ways that Green has to go now is either playing this more like multicolor, like more interactive game, which is definitely a good thing to be doing. Or you can try and just move your clock up a little bit more, and instead of trying to cast 8 drops, just try and cast like the really good 4 drops really quickly. You become a lot more about like your questing beasts, your Minsk and Booze. I think you're probably not straight mono green here very often, but you get rid of the 8 drops. You're more about the 3 to 5 drops. Like Elf into Lalia, really, really good. And then you,
I love that deck personally. Like the Gruul Monsters deck. That is so much fun.
Yeah. I think it's really powerful. And then you also have the upside of like when they kill your elf, like you can just cast your Lalia on turn 3, and it's a really good card. Like it doesn't matter. Like one card I've actually been low-key really impressed by is Orcish Lumberjack. Bit of a blast from the past, but I think it's good now.
Yeah.
Like,
is Orcish Lumberjack back? Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
So Orcish Lumberjack is red for a 1/1, I assume orc. You can
yeah.
You'd really hope so. You can tap it, sacrifice a forest to add 3 mana in any combination of red or green. Like, you play this on turn 1, you have 5 mana on turn 2. You can just do something so degenerate on turn 2 that it kind of doesn't matter. It's going to snowball you. It doesn't matter if you're down a forest. You'll probably only use it once in a game. That's completely fine. Yeah, I think that's the other way Green can go, is just try and accelerate out cheaper things so that you can cast them if they kill your dogs, and they're still great if you can pay them on turn 2, and that can be good enough, and you're like kind of mitigating a lot of the weaknesses of Green, of the straight mono green deck, but you're still getting to utilize the acceleration, which is what Green does best.
No, exactly, and that's also kind of where they're actually printing new cards for. Because we obviously, Questing Beast is probably longer ago than I would like to admit, but Undermountain Adventure at 4. Like I personally quite like the Nuthrun at 5, but you also have just like Verdurous Georg is what, like 8 power with trample onto like on a 5-drop. That's fine, and then like I think it like these decks could still go up to 6. Like I would be perfectly fine. Like keep the natural order, but like natural order for like old One Eye. That's a big Tyrant. It's like a 6 mana 6/6 with trample with other creatures you control have trample, and then when it enters the battlefield, you also create a 5/5 Tyrant creature token, and also it comes back from the graveyard. It does so much. It is a game-winning threat. That is more power and toughness than like a Titan of Industry or a Woodfall Primus. It's more power and toughness, and it comes back, and you could realistically hardcast it. Yeah, lower your curve and play things that you can hardcast, or aim to ramp them out. But if it goes badly, you can still just hardcast your big things and hit someone in the face with it.
Yeah, 100%. You're very capable of having 6 lands in play at some point of the game. Your card is not dead because they killed all your elves. One of the big shifts with going into these other sorts of green decks is because you're often like 2+ colors, you really start valuing the dorks that tap for more than 1 color, like a lot higher than your land war elves. And that does mean you have to fight for them a bit more, but the Hierarchs are obviously phenomenal here because they also play into your beatdown plan with the Exalted ability. But stuff like Delighted Halfling is really perfect for this sort of deck. And then just the fact that you're, maybe you're like Gruul based or you're green based, like you also get like just cheap interactive cards like all the other decks get, and you can actually, you don't just roll over and die because your opponent played a spell that lined up against yours. You have outs to deal with things. And that is not to be underestimated. And it's something that if you stick to straight mono green, you certainly don't get.
No, exactly. So I think what we're kind of almost settling on is that it isn't just a power level thing with mono green. It's also just like a where Magic is in 2023. It's like an environment thing. Like it's in general, like the only monocolored decks that are still seeing playing cube is mono white and mono red because they're quite easy. They're aggressive. Like mono blue isn't really a thing. Mono black isn't a thing. Like maybe just mono green, as we knew it and as we loved it, is a thing that it needs to be in a cube that is designed to work around monocolored archetypes. And with the way cube design and Magic design is going in general, people are playing more colors. Like triomes exist. Like basically the door's been kicked open. Everyone can splash as much as they want nowadays. That's not good for a monocolored deck. Like, and because the rewards are not really there, because the rewards for being mono green are quite old, it means that it's not as strong, and it probably needs to exist in a cube environment that is supporting monocolored in all 5 colors, basically.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with that. I think it's I mean, we were saying earlier, they probably haven't printed a like properly premium, like this is a defining card for mono green in like 10 years. That's going to be a tough spot for any archetype, because that's every other archetype's got some really, really premium upgrades, and feels like mono green just hasn't.
Yeah, I mean, mono red has had like things like Ragavan, like all this kind of stuff. Like mono white has had plenty of stuff. Like it's just getting more and more like Mother of Runes effects all the time, this kind of stuff. But like, yeah, mono green just isn't getting the love that the other colors that the other mono colors have had in order to keep up with other decks that exist.
Yeah. And I think this is partly just a thing of the direction that Wizards design has gone, right? Is that they don't really want super explosive mana ramp to be like dominant. And that's kind of what this deck does.
And yeah, just on the ramp is like, one of the best things about this deck is that it can ramp into Oblivion in theory. But especially in Powered Cube, where this is still seeing a lot of play, like other archetypes can still ramp with like Moxen, and the ramp is there in the Vintage Cube for other decks.
It's certainly true that I think mono green's always been a bit weaker in Powered Cube than Unpowered Cube. For example, if you stick with the Mitgo frame of reference, it was always better in Mitgo Legacy Cube than Mitgo Vintage Cube, because in Legacy Cube, green was unique in its ability to accelerate very quickly, whereas in Powered Cube, that just isn't the case, right? Other people can have those broken ramp starts. Obviously, green gets to play more ramp than everyone else, but it comes with a bunch of downsides, as we said. And just very fast combo has always been a rough matchup for mono green. Things like a very good Storm deck are just always going to be a real issue. And in Legacy, in like the slightly lower powered cube, certainly used to be true that basically no one was really doing their degenerate thing that won the game quicker than you were. They had to slow you down. It's a little bit less true now, maybe, but yeah, I think it certainly maybe needs a slightly lower power level of cube. For example, in your cube, right? Like, imagine you're playing mono green and your opponent has like Thassa's Oracle Console deck. You just
we are taking out Demonic Consultation.
Yeah.
We are doing that.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, you can't interact
exactly,
with it, and you can never go quicker than it if they draw it. So like, it's a bit tough.
No, exactly. I think one thing I did want to touch on as well, just one issue, it's that it is actually quite an expensive archetype to support. It means that it's less viable in Budget Cube, because obviously things like Gaia's Cradle is obscenely expensive because it's not just played in Cube, it is played as in Legacy. It's a very desirable card in Commander. People want it. Like, Hoof is not cheap. Finale is actually, I think, more expensive than Natural Order at the moment, because I think Natural Order is probably banned in a lot of places apart from like Commander. But then even like the good mana dorks, like your Delighted Halfling, is Noble Hierarch still pricey? Like, yeah, it's a tenner. It means that kind of like it struggles to work even at like a budget setting as well. It really struggles to find a place. But like to just touch on what you said about like the Legacy Cube setting, like is that where you think you could see it?
Yeah, I think it probably has a place in a cube where you have a lot of strong cards, but and you think it can cope with putting in Raphaelos and Tree Speaker and Huff, but you don't have like other like really fast combo decks that can go under it, and then it's going to be in a spot where, yeah, it will probably lose to the people who can interact with it really well, but it will beat up on the aggro decks who are just going to be slower, and then maybe it becomes like it's a kind of fine. It won't be the strongest deck in the cube, but it will be like a fine deck.
Right, thank you all very much for watching. Please make sure you like, share, and subscribe, all that YouTube good stuff. And if you found this episode particularly helpful, make sure you subscribe to the Powerful Nothing podcast, available on platforms everywhere. But until next time, I will see you all soon. Goodbye.